Okay, for our last speaker for the first round, for the Philippines, we have Dr. So Iglesias from the University of Philippines. So is an assistant professor in political science and a member of the editorial advisory board of New Mandala and a co-convener of the Women in Southeast Asian Social Science. She was the inaugural scholar in residence of the Justice in Southeast Asia Laboratory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2023. The American Political Science Association's Democracy and Autocracy Committee selected her as an emerging scholar in 2020, and she won an APSA Asia Program Fellowship and Research Grant in 2021. She's also a Southeast Asia Research Group Fellow in 2017. Please welcome Dr. So.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. And I'd like to thank the University of Sydney's Center for Southeast Asian Studies for inviting me, especially. Thanks to SSEAC. What I'll discuss today is the current political situation, but mainly what's been happening over the last 3 years, and to some extent, what's been happening in the last 3 days. Okay, so there is a backdrop of state weakness and democratic backsliding. I'll talk about the alliance between the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the namesake and son of the ousted dictator, as well as his alliance with the vice president, Sara Duterte, who is the daughter of Mr. Marcos's predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, their alliance and the marriage and divorce of this conservative alliance. What some analysts, it's a joke, but it may be a half joke, Team Darkness versus Team Evil. I periodicize this over 3 rounds of contention, the current one being over the impeachment trial before concluding. Okay, so what we just need to understand somewhat about Philippine politics, this will come as no surprise. It's a very weak state. First of all, since independence, let's say, even if, we've had elections for over 100 years, but the state is very weak. And it is plagued by an oligarchy, a political elite that jealously guards its power over elections as well as over the economy. We are also hobbled by low party system institutionalization. AIM, in fact, wrote about that in a book chapter before. And so what we see is that political parties in the Philippines are thinly disguised fig leaves or vehicles for political dynasties, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Okay. And then looking at this graph, you can see data from VDEM, right? The very low point, of course, is during the Marcos Sr. dictatorship from 72 until he was ousted in 86. So even at the high point of democracy after the end of dictatorship, democratic quality has been quite poor, right? And then you see this dip in recent years that corresponds to the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. I'll talk about the national war on drugs in particular that accompanied that presidency. But then you also see, and now Duterte is being tried for crimes against humanity in The Hague, or is waiting for to be tried. But also you see a stagnation under the last 3 years of Marcos Jr., slight improvement, but by even VDEM's democratic backsliding measure, the Philippines continues to experience democratic backsliding. So like the quality of democracy now compared to say 10 years ago is still quite poor. Okay, so after that, as a backdrop and as a frame for as a frame for understanding what's going on today. So the last presidential election occurred in 2022. You see here the candidates at the time, just before the announcement of them teaming up in the elections. But this unit team, as it was called, was brokered essentially to avoid them going against each other. So this is the strange thing about this marriage of convenience. Sara Duterte was actually polling #1 prior to the announcement and the filing of candidatures. So it is a puzzle, right? Why would she, as the daughter of the sitting president, highly popular president, even towards the end of his term, and she seemed to be benefiting from that popularity. She was mayor of Davao City, never held an elective post, a national post, but she was polling #1. Marcos Jr. was polling #2. This marriage was brokered by Amy Marcos, apparently Marcos Jr.'s sister, and former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. I should have pointed out earlier that Philippine democracy had actually experienced the backsliding before under that particular president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Anyway, so this was brokered. The only rational explanation one could probably, or the main rational explanation for this would be to avoid the possibility, and it was actually a very slim possibility, of reformist candidate Leni Robredo, who was trailing at the period when this was announced, this marriage was announced. Leni Robredo was trailing in the polls, but then her campaign indeed got momentum. But in the end, the Marcos Duterte alliance created an unbeatable electoral result, very decisive, for the first time since 1986, since the post-dictatorship period, very decisive outright majorities. There were socialist and left-wing candidates in the mix, but they were never going to win. But they did tend to elevate the level of discourse. Okay. So let's talk about round 1 and what then happened after the elections were won and the dust had basically settled. So at the onset, Sara Duterte made clear that she wanted the defense portfolio because normally vice presidents are given a cabinet position to give them something more than just being, the runner-up, to Miss Universe. But then she was immediately, so this was at the start, right? This was immediately denied. She was given the Department of Education. So she was Education Secretary until she recently resigned. But, during that first year of government, everyone was still playing nice, okay? So for example, when Sara Duterte presented her budget to Congress, it was approved within minutes, practically. And she was sent off with a smile and a wink, right? Very huge budget for the vice president's office at the time. But then, so after that first year, then things started to change, right? There was, first of all, a security sector shakeup, both in the police and the military. The police having been, by the way, the primary executor, literally, of Duterte's war on drugs, right? So, and this shakeup was to dislodge Duterte loyalists, essentially. And then at the end of the first financial cycle, this confidential fund scandal of the vice president, Sara Duterte, started to rear its head because the Commission on Audit flagged several questionable expenses, both from the OVP as well as the Education Office, and especially the spending of 125 million pesos, roughly $2.2 million US, over the course of 11 days. Okay, so that started to rear its head in Congress. There were questions over this report by the Commission on Audit the next time she came to Congress to defend her budget. Meanwhile, Elder Duterte was facing his own set of troubles. So Marcos Jr., when they were still in a uniteam alliance, he had been the only presidential candidate to campaign on a promise that he would never cooperate as president. If elected, he would never cooperate with the International Criminal Court, which had already been investigating former President Duterte for crimes against humanity. So during the past year, in 2024, something called a Quadcom started to conduct congressional inquiries into, so Quad, extrajudicial killings, because it involved the Human Rights Committee, public order and safety, drugs, and good governance. And these Quadcom hearings in Congress and similar hearings in the Senate by the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee, which is, again, the governance, sort of good governance committee in the Senate, they uncovered through testimonies of former Duterte cabinet members or officials, including police officials, this sort of web of illicit financing, human trafficking, offshore gaming, catering to the Chinese government that may have been financing the incentives, the informal incentives, financial incentives to drive up the killings during the drug war. So those were the different connections that were coming out. In fact, Mr. Duterte was summoned before Congress and the Senate, and he turned up. And this would have been unthinkable when he was president. The Senate was far friendlier to him, but the Congressional Quadcom Committee, the lower house committee that questioned him over these links, over witness testimonies that they had heard, they were extremely hostile, and this was something. So that means, give it all together, including the impeachment of Sara Duterte by the lower house of Congress. And I'll come back to that. Late last year, in December 2020, so all of this was culminating with the filings of civil society filings of impeachment by the end of 2024. It looked like the nadir of Duterte's influence, right? Then Sara Duterte was impeached in February, in early 2025, and in March 7, if I'm not mistaken, of this year, former President Duterte was arrested with the cooperation of the Philippine government, because he could not have been arrested in the Philippines if the Philippine government hadn't cooperated. The excuse was they were cooperating with the Interpol, not with the ICC. And so President Marcos fulfilled his promise. But essentially, they complied with the ICC arrest order that came. Within 1 or 2 days, all of this was wrapped up and he was sent to The Hague on a plane. So round 2. This occurred prior to the midterm elections in May, and I'll come back to that. First, there were, and by the way, this photo is not of some sort of goth rock MTV video. It's actually Amy Marcos's last-minute campaign video just prior to the election, within weeks of election day, where Sara Duterte is raising her hand. She flipped from being part of her brother's administration slate to Sara Duterte, to the Duterte allied slate. But before I go back to the implications for the Senate, first I'll talk about a couple of things that also occurred as a result of the elections. It was the unexpected showing of Bam Aquino, who is number 2, that green, if you just look at the final column, that green number, corresponding to that green number, and Kiko Pangilinan as well, who ran with Leni Robredo. Okay, so Bam Aquino and Kiko Pangilinan are linked to the Kakamping campaign, although there are some differences in their political branding in 2025. The Kakamping campaign, pink was the color of Leni Robredo's campaign. Leni Robredo was Marcos Jr.'s main rival, although she was far, far behind, as I mentioned. When we had before the election, all we had seen were the April surveys. But it turned out only after the election, when everything was counted, we saw a survey from early May that showed that basically people changed their minds at the last minute. Some people were wondering, was it a pink surge, a pink surge of support, or a youth surge that would have tended to be more democratic, essentially, in their voting? But no, there wasn't really. I mean, I think academics like myself will still, chew on this for years to come. But what seems to be evident now is that there was a lot of last minute decision making, which is not unusual for voters. Voters often vote emotionally and in the last minute. Also, in the earlier surveys, there was apparently an average of, people were saying, oh, they're going to vote for about 8 people out of 12 for the Senate specifically, and then they'll decide closer to the elections who they're going to vote for. So there was also a lot of machine politics, some conservative, unexpected conservative support. So this Team Diliman versus Team Kasamaan kind of rivalry actually benefited that sort of third force to some extent through machine mobilization of the more conservative political machineries. Okay, another outcome, serious outcome of the 2025 midterm elections is that, things are, dynastic politics remains. Now, I know a lot of people out there were very excited by some dynasties losing their seats, for example, in Cebu and in other places. But that was still quite marginal. I mean, it's not a bad development, but in elections, dynasties do fall. This is not unusual. But what we see more is our political lingo has been adapting over time. We talked about in the past vertical thin dynasties and fat dynasties taking office either successively over time or at the same time. Now we're talking about obese dynasties with people from the same family, 5 or more members of the same family. And the incoming Senate, a third of them are going to be siblings. Okay. Oh, so the impeachment trial at the end of round 2, the Duterte's arrest changed the dynamic, but ultimately it was partially a rebuke of the Marcos alliance. They only got 5 seats out of 12. Normally, in the Philippines, unlike places like the US, for example, midterm elections are usually, they go in favor of the incumbent, and then the lame duck period begins. But in this midterm election, very, very rarely it happens, the administration only actually got 5 seats, okay? And because of that surge, pro-Duterte surge, they were able to secure 5 seats. And then those 2 progressive senators make up the rest. So 12 senators at the brink, at the cusp of an impeachment trial, change the political calculations as well of how the senators are probably angling. And also one thing to understand is that the election was for half of the Senate because they have staggered terms. So there are 12 sitting senators that will remain and carry over to the next Congress, the 20th Congress. Okay, so round 3 has been over Sara Duterte's impeachment. Why? What is at stake? What is at stake is, does Sara Duterte run for president in 2028? If she is impeached, she will be barred from running. So there was this curious delay because as I mentioned earlier, civil society had already, sponsored impeachment complaints in December. Those were kind of ignored and set aside. An administration-led impeachment complaint succeeded, and she was impeached in February. But then between February and just last Monday, the Senate sat on convening as an impeachment court. So there was all this question of what the Constitution meant. When an impeachment complaint is initiated, the Senate is supposed to commence the trial forthwith. But what does forthwith mean? Apparently, in political time, it can mean as much as 4 months, 5 months, right? There was a civil society pushback just in the last couple of weeks when the Senate postponed the sort of commencement of the impeachment trial proceedings from June 2 last week to just this Monday. Members of like my colleagues at the University of the Philippines, for example, and several other universities and groups weighed in on what forthwith means, right? But basically saying, like, if the Senate does not proceed with the impeachment trial, it is turning its back on its constitutional duty, and that's what it looks like. So on Tuesday, the Senate 18-3 voted to return the impeachment complaint to Congress, and we've done impeachments before, including of a president back in 2001, right? And this has never been done. And this is, as some scholars argue, is unconstitutional. But like I said, people are positioning for 2028 because of the change in dynamic of the midterm elections. The Dutertes have come out looking stronger than we had initially expected. And so people are thinking, what's going to happen if Sara Duterte becomes president in 2028? Where am I going to fit in that? So just to conclude, there is a pro-democracy constituency in the Philippines, which, as a result of democratic backsliding, is probably more like a hybrid competitive authoritarian regime by now. So, and precisely because that pro-democracy constituency is outnumbered, it doesn't really, it can be mobilized to elect a certain percentage of voter share, but there is a certain hard limit to that. And that's something like 15, 16 million votes only. So apart from term limits, because we still have the 1987 post-dictatorship pro-democracy constitution, right? Successive presidents have tried to change it unsuccessfully. But apart from term limits so that they can stay longer in power and subvert the democratic intent of the 1987 constitution, I think we are realizing now that there's no real need to change the constitution. You can just ignore it and get away with it as democracy slides backwards, right? So the current Senate has currently we have an impasse that the Senate has created, an outcome that, as I mentioned, as we're expecting, will shape the 2028 elections and the future of democracy in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sol, for that very useful review of Philippine politics these days. My name is Miles Cooper. Once upon a time, I was Australia's ambassador to the Philippines. I'd like to ask you about the Philippines' place these days in relation to ASEAN. I long felt that the Philippines was geographically offshore from the rest of Southeast Asia and also psychologically. What's the situation these days? Is it moving back to connect with the rest of Southeast Asia, or is the relationship with the US changing that or holding that back? I'd be very appreciative of your views.
Sure. Thank you for the question. My take on this is that the diplomatic corps and the sort of institutions and approach mindset of our foreign office would very much buy into ASEAN centrality. Successive presidents, I think, traditionally the executive is quite proud of the Philippines' role as one of the founding members of ASEAN and being part of that sort of core within ASEAN. But I think you're right. There is an insularity overall to Philippine regional politics. We are embroiled in our own, usually the gaze is domestically rather than internationally or regionally. And if the gaze is international, it's usually, traditionally it's been towards the US. The US remains to provide, important security guarantees for the Philippines, weak or strong, and the Trump 2 administration. But the Philippines military, the armed forces, for example, is more oriented towards domestic counterinsurgency and very ill-equipped to defend the Philippines from, say, an incursion of, if it ever came to a hot war with China over the South China Sea / West Philippine Sea, as it's called inside our country, we would definitely not come out well, So having just one short mention at the recent ASEAN summit, President Marcos Jr. did try to sort of rally the ASEAN troops and revive ASEAN level discussions about a sort of common interest in respecting international law. We won the tribunal ruling, after all, against China over this contestation over the South China Sea. But how far is that going to travel? I don't know. We know that ASEAN has always been divided over this anyway. And as was mentioned earlier, ASEAN faces many hurdles beyond economic cooperation, even economic cooperation, right? It's very difficult. Where's the ASEAN free trade area, for example, and that sort of thing. Okay, I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you. My name is Shahir. Actually, I'm not from political science major, but this is a great event for me to learn something more, especially dealing with the interdisciplinary growth and knowledge. So I've been listening to Mr. Andrew, Dr. Ladawan Khaikham, and Dr. So Iglesias from Vietnam, Thailand, and Philippines. So what I can see is that there is a certain pattern of the use of power, and then how that power and trust are being built to lead the people. But my question is dealing with the theme of our conference today. It's about politics in action. As someone from English and writing major, so I'm thinking about this basic question. What would be, in your perspective, the path or futuristic patterns that might lead people in this region, especially Southeast Asian, to go with a democracy or to deal with the existing dynamics, especially in Philippines in your case?
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Saul.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and we can maybe go back to it during the sort of roundtable later. At least for the Philippines, there's an speaking of the Constitution, the Philippine Constitution, there's an anti-dynasty provision in the Constitution that simply has never been implemented by Congress, which is peopled by politicians from these dynasties. They've simply never allowed a bill to successfully pass into law. So that's the problem when the inmates are in charge of the asylum, right? And so the only source of pro-democracy energy really comes from the people. And unfortunately, voters can be authoritarian in orientation. They often vote, and increasingly do, vote against democracy. So that brings me to that sort of pro-democracy constituency, right? Which is one thing that the Philippines has enjoyed since the end of dictatorship has been a very strong civil society. This is a source of what some scholars call diagonal accountability. Horizontal accountability being checks and balances, right? Among the different branches of co-equal branches of government, vertical accountability being accountability to the electorate. So the media, non-government organizations, especially in the absence of strong political parties, this is the pro-democracy constituency in the Philippines, and it's constantly under threat. It is politically and violently repressed, but that's the only source that I can see where democratic change will come from. Sorry to be so pessimistic. I mean, there's a little kernel of hope in that, but yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Sol, I just want to raise the question about the good governance, because you mentioned it about it's progressing in Philippines right now, but what kind of good governance do they promote it? Because given the context of the political dynasty in Philippines. The second one, as you mentioned before, just a little bit, can you explain further of the general relationship between CSO with the government itself? Because last month, I have a experience to visit one of a city in Philippines, and we heard about how CSO is being pressured and how they assume as an ally of the Communist Party. But the other hand, we also found that there's a lot of CSO working hand in hand with the government. So maybe you can explain the landscape of this kind of relationship between CSO and government. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that question. So the general relationship between civil society and any sitting government is usually adversarial, right? So in the weakness of checks and balances among co-equal branches of government, we were just seeing how this is the Senate, right? This is the Senate, 5 people voting against basically stopping the impeachment process, just essentially, let's say, even if there are some technical differences, right? So what we see here is an encapsulation of a weak check by the legislature on the executive or for democracy. And the judiciary performs some checks and balance, but it can also be sometimes co-opted. And some research has shown that it's actually very compliant, usually with the executive. Although now the executive that we're talking about is split between the president and the vice president, of course. So what is good? So that's why civil society tends to perform usually an adversarial role vis-a-vis these very powerful elites in all branches of government. So the phenomenon that you refer to, though, is a practice that we call, or can be understood probably generally here as red tagging. So this, red tagging as a practice is as old as communism itself. But red tagging in the Philippines had really intensified under the Duterte administration. Not in the beginning, because ironically, Duterte styled himself as a sort of left-wing president at the beginning, and even had members from the radical left in his cabinet initially. But then after the war on drugs proved to be a bit of a political liability, it would remain popular, but it was a political liability. He turned his sights onto the ongoing communist insurgency and created something called the National Task Force to End Local Communism, or NTF-LCAP, which proceeded to red tag people as communists and therefore enemies of the state. And they red tagged so many different types of people. Basically, anyone who ranging from people who were criticizing the government to dissidents. My colleagues have been red tagged. My whole university has been red tagged. Whole universities had been red tagged, then and still to some extent now. The practice has decreased somewhat, but, red tagging is a way of sort of signaling that these people can be hurt either politically or physically with impunity because they're communists. But communism is not a crime in the Philippines. Okay. So anyway, yeah, so civil society plays an important adversarial role. Sometimes they work with government, sometimes they're co-opted by government, right? But ultimately they are a force, I would believe, the last sort of, at the end of the when if everything is over, it will be the final line of defense for democracy. Okay, thank you so much.